Hi, everyone. Welcome to Cold War Spaces. I'm Anna Rose. I'm the Exhibition and Programming Associate at the Wende Museum. And today's topic is Socialist Friendship Space, Soviet Advisors in Communist China. I'd like to welcome our guest today, Deborah Kaple. She's a research scholar and lecturer in the Sociology department at Princeton University. Her publications include Dream of a Red Factory, The Legacy of High Stalinism in China, and Gulag Boss, a Soviet memoir. She's the guest editor of a special issue on China and the USSR for Modern China Studies called The Forgotten Decade, a retrospective look at the 1950s, as well as several articles and chapters on the Soviet Advisors program in China in the 1950s. She's currently working on a book analyzing the origins and consequences of Khrushchev's secret speech and its particular impact on communist China. This program will be about a 30-minute conversation between Deborah and Segal, Wende's chief curator and director of programming. After that, we'll leave about 15 minutes for Q&A, so get your questions ready to put in the Q&A box during that time. As always, we appreciate all of your questions, but please keep them short, no longer than a sentence or two. And as we're getting started, feel free to say hi in the chat, and it's always nice to see what city you're tuning in from. We'll be posting the recording of this program today on our Vimeo page and also in podcast format on our SoundCloud page. Lastly, I'd like to thank Susan Horwitz and Rick Feldman for generously supporting discussion series at the Wende and our virtual programs. And I'll hand it off to you to get started. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna Rose. And Deborah, welcome to Cold War Spaces. Wonderful to have you today.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's start with a personal question. What motivated you to research the history of Soviet advisors in Maoist China? What was your starting point?
Well, I guess it began in college. I went to college at Ohio State University. I'm from Ohio. And I was an art major and in the College of Arts and Sciences. And then I found out that I needed a language and I didn't want to study a language. But in any case, I read an article in the student-run newspaper about Save Soviet Jewry and how the Slavic department was pairing with them. And if we took Russian language, we would be having some interactions with real Russians and working with them and maybe even studying with people who couldn't even speak English. So I took the class and I loved it. And the next class I took was a class about socialism. And the two professors who taught it, one was a China specialist, one was a Russia specialist. And so I got really interested in doing that myself, I guess. I went on at every little job I had, I tried to work on Sino-Soviet after that. And finally, I applied to graduate school and went to Princeton University, where I still am. And because we had a pretty strong part of our curriculum on comparative historical sociology, which is where I fit in sociology.
Right, I see, okay. So, yeah, China had a very invasion and then the civil war that followed it. So what motivated the Soviet Union to help build this country in 1949 as a socialist country? And what was in it for the Soviet Union?
Do you mean right at the very beginning?
At the very beginning. So why did they set up this program of advisors to China?
Yeah, well, first of all, Stalin was always very geopolitical. He looked at China as a big open space for him, and he imagined two giant countries, both communist. And, you know, the Soviets had thought after the Russian Revolution came that the rest of the world would easily fall to communism. And when that didn't happen, the head of the Russian Revolution, Vladimir Lenin, set up the Communist International, and we call it the Comintern. And the Comintern sent out hardened revolutionaries all around the world to places they thought would be ripe for communism. And they targeted China. They got in there. They were able to put a group together of the few people who had studied Marxism and knew about communism, and finally actually founded the Chinese Communist Party using Comintern money and experts and materials. And it began first as a wing of the Comintern and later got its own statutes.
Right. No, I think it's remarkable because the Soviet Union, of course, suffered heavily during the Second World War, and the economy was devastated, so that they still found the power to support another big country seems very remarkable.
It's pretty crazy. I know.
So I wonder, Mao was very inspired by certain aspects of Stalin's politics. I mentioned the planned economy, the very fast and speedy industrialization, agricultural collectivization, but also, for instance, the labor camps, the gulags. Did he just copy those elements from the Soviet Union, or did he try to give it a specific Chinese character?
Well, in particular, the gulags. He was interested in the gulags and how they work. They were interested in the gulags. Mao was even in the 1930s because they were in the newspapers. He asked Mao himself called up the Soviet Union, called somebody and asked them to come and give them a presentation on how the gulags operated in the Soviet Union. So initially in the Soviet Union, gulag camps were supposed to be political reform camps. In other words, if you were not really communist enough, you'd gotten into trouble, they would teach these errant criminals through, well, little sessions with experts and also hard labor.
Right.
So they set up two camps in the beginning, Solovki, the first one, and the second one, the Belomor Canal, dug the Belomor Canal. And, you know, honestly, in the first camp, they really tried with this sort of indoctrination program. The second one was so overwhelming for them, and they had so few resources, and so they really had no idea what they were doing. And so in that second camp, which is a very important part of the Gulag history, they kind of abandoned that whole thing of doing mind control. And they actually never picked it up again. But this is where Mao and the Chinese communists were good historians of Soviet Union.
I see, yeah, because the re-education element, of course, is very prevalent in Chinese camps. Yeah. So who were the Soviet advisors who were sent to China? How were they selected? And also, did they want to go? What motivated them?
Well, they were all Communist Party members. In fact, that was what I interviewed 25 of these men and women in Moscow in the early 1990s. They were older people then. And they felt that it was a huge boondoggle. They wanted to go. The only thing that they had to have in common with the party was they had to be members of the party. That was the #1 recommendation. That was shocking to me to find out that that was the main requirement. Otherwise, they were told that they were going to go to China and that they would be teaching the Chinese the very job that they do. So, hey, that's easy. They were enticed by the fact that they would be traveling in a very exotic place that nobody knew much about. And that seemed exciting. They were amateurs. And don't forget, in the early 50s, Russia was still pretty much war-torn itself. Right. It was pretty bad there. People were still there wasn't enough housing. They couldn't, they just hadn't, their recovery from the war went on for a long time, let's put it that way. Food shortages and demands for them to work extra hours for no pay under Stalin. So there was that motivation, but the biggest motivation was they found out that they would be paid in China and their salaries at home would be banked and they would have that to come back to. So all around, it was a win-win situation for all of them told me this.
I see. You mentioned the aspect of the attraction of an exotic country. Were they actually, when they went to China, did they experience a kind of culture shock? Were they prepared for what they found there, or was it all very strange?
It was all very strange. First of all, the Soviet government didn't give them any sort of pamphlets to learn anything about China. They didn't encourage them to learn any Chinese. Right. They really just told them they were going to go there and do the job, and everybody said, okay. So they got there and they weren't prepared for many aspects of China. One was, well, the huge number of people always around everywhere. That's, because in Russia, the population is like this to a giant this. you know. In
Right.
China, that's not true. And the second thing was that they saw real poverty. They saw little kids running around with no food and filthy, and they told me these stories, like they tried to help the children when they found them. One of the female Soviet advisors told me she bought some bars of soap and gave them to the children, and the children began to eat them.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So they really just had no concept of what Chinese people were till they got there.
Right.
And then it
right.
took a while too. No language.
No, I understand. Yeah. So what was the professional background of these Soviet advisors? Were they all technicians, engineers, etc., or also historians, artists?
The Soviets, they chose people from every aspect. What they wanted to do was to have a couple of people from every industry, every profession, everything that mattered in Soviet life, to take it to China and give it to them as the model. So I wish I could say I found the paper that shows how they decided what mattered. But, you know, there were people there to redo the way Chinese taught school. There were people there to teach them propaganda, in particular poster propaganda, because until this time, the Chinese were painting these beautiful posters of Mao and Stalin at their normal heights. But Mao's a very big man and Stalin was a small man. And so they were told right up front, they're always the same size in the posters.
Right. Interesting.
Yes.
Yeah.
But they worked on their ideology. They worked in the Chinese Communist Party offices. They worked in, of course, industry and food service, everything.
I see. Yeah. So how many people are we talking about? How many Soviet advisors?
Oh,
went
I
to
wish I
China?
could answer that question. No, I don't know. Probably thousands. I don't know. We know this is the thing about this, the Russians, with this project at least. The records are so confusing, you can never tell. And no Russian historian in Russia has ever said how many people went. I'd say between 5 and 20,000. I don't know.
Right. Interesting. Yeah.
Also, they came, and sometimes stayed for half a year, sometimes stayed for 2 years, sometimes stayed only for a few weeks. So then it is hard to count.
Right.
No,
For sure. I understand it. Yeah.
Mhm.
So this program started under Stalin in the Soviet Union, but he died in March 1953. What happened to this program under his successor, Khrushchev?
Khrushchev was actually very interested in the program. He supported it. In fact, he gave more money and support to Mao than Stalin ever did. Stalin was supportive, but he was stingy. And also, the Soviet Union was getting a little richer under Khrushchev than it was when Stalin started.
Right.
And Khrushchev was very interested in this whole enterprise. He was a true blood communist. And so he thought this was a great idea too. But as soon as he got to Beijing and Mao acted, I mean, let's put it not so nicely. He was mean. He was just mean to him.
In what way? Can you give an example?
Yes, he knew his handlers, Mao's handlers told him that Khrushchev couldn't abide by cigarette smoke. Well, Mao smoked, and he made a point of blowing smoke into Khrushchev's face whenever he could.
Yeah.
And he also cut him off when he spoke, and it was just, sometimes he asked Khrushchev to come in and have a meeting in his personal quarters, and Khrushchev would arrive, and Mao was in bed in pajamas.
Right. So why did he treat Khrushchev that way while he was so admiring of Stalin, and in the knowledge that he actually received so much more support from Khrushchev?
Yeah, I really think it's because, Stalin was the real leader of the country, and Khrushchev was like a fake leader compared to Stalin in his ideology, especially. Stalin was the kind of man that Mao wanted to be. He was cruel and larger than life and inaccessible. And Khrushchev was bouncing around the country giving little talks. And also Khrushchev changed the whole meaning of the USSR when he took power. He wanted to make people's lives better. He wanted socialism to be a good thing for people. He went ahead and, not only did he denounce Stalin, that was his major problem. He denounced him in public at the 20th Party Congress, but he also went about trying to enrich everybody and make everybody feel good about being in a communist country.
Right, yeah.
Mao just couldn't go with that.
Yeah. So you mentioned the 20th Party Congress, which was in February 1956. And if I understood you correctly, things between Khrushchev and Mao started to spiral down after that speech, right?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. There were many, communistic, hard to read articles that came out between Russia and China that made clear that the Chinese were completely not on board with this whole project and that they were going to go on their own. And what it meant to go on their own was actually just to follow the Stalin model.
Right, right.
And they were going to be the true bearers of Stalin's communist model.
Yeah.
Which I think they are.
So, how would you say that this change in politics and relations, official relations between China and the Soviet Union impacted the Soviet advisors on the ground? I imagine they had personal connections to their Chinese colleagues, there were friendships. How did this impact, or how did politics impact these relations?
Well, it being such a large country and there being so many advisors there, they were very loosely connected to the Soviet network. So I discovered in these interviews that many of them didn't realize what had happened. They just didn't, they didn't hear about it. And what they said to me was, it just is that our Chinese comrades stopped working. And they started going to these big rallies inside buildings that were locked against us. We were not allowed in there. And we found out they were doing something called self-criticism. That's an old Soviet tactic from way before Stalin. And this Soviet said, I've heard of it, but I don't know what it is. It was so old. Wow. So this is a way that they were just pursuing Stalinism, is using one of those old tactics. Right. Well, it was really just everybody standing up and, confessing and I don't know, just being in there for hours and hours and hours. So what they really noticed was that their work together was starting to be damaged by that.
I see, but did they continue having positive and friendly relationships with their Chinese co-workers, or did that also get more and more troublesome?
No, on the right at the workspace, it's my understanding that they remain friendly. Everybody on both sides, in all the sort of literature that comes out later, the memoirs, they all talk about how lovely it was to work with each other. They made their way through the languages. And so, and there's a huge nostalgia on both sides for that connection.
That's interesting. Do you any actually complaints about Maoist politics to their Soviet contacts?
No, I never heard anything like that.
Okay, interesting. Yeah.
I think that politics would not be a thing that they would be discussing.
No, right. Yeah. Another question I'm curious about is that the Soviet Union was not the only country to send help and advisors to China. Many other East Bloc countries did the same. Did they do it also in the same way? And was there a kind of division of tasks between the Soviet Union and the other countries? Or how did that work?
I think that it was still all coordinated through Moscow, because remember, it is the socialist bloc. And right. Moscow had the handle on that. They did work side by side. And a couple of years ago, I looked into this big building that is an art complex in Beijing, and it's been turned into an art complex, but it was a Soviet and East German built building, based on a building that is already existing from a long time ago in St. Petersburg. So because it was a light bulb factory, And
Mhm.
because the Chinese and the Russians feel that this is a security issue, there's no data about this, but I managed to look into the blogs of the people who live there. There was
Yeah.
a lot of stuff in there about that. And they talked about how everybody really loved the East Germans. They said the East Germans were better carpenters and better people, but the Russians were nice too. So I think
Yeah.
they all worked on the same thing together, but there were some differences probably between them.
Right, right. Is it also that maybe the East Germans sent better quality materials? Do you know about that? Or
I don't know. I don't know. I haven't seen
That's
anything about that.
right, right. So another question I have is in how far those personal relationships, and you really went deep into them, have been impacted by the Chinese Secret Service? Were the Chinese who were part of these collaborations surveyed by the Secret Service, and how did that impact them?
You know, I heard a lot about this from the people I actually interviewed.
Mhm.
And one guy told me this little anecdote. He said, well, first of all, let me back up and say the advisors were a little chagrined when they got there and found out that they had no freedom in China. That even if their hotel, they stayed in hotels, even if their hotel was 10 feet away from the work site, they would be walked there or they would be put into a car and driven there. Because the Chinese government wanted to discourage any kind of commingling.
Right.
So even though they wanted their help. So this guy told me, he said, I got into the car with the other advisors and we went a couple of blocks and I said, wait, go back. I forgot my toolkit. So the driver goes back and he runs into his room and he opens the door and he sees another person there, a Chinese person, and the guy was rummaging around in his drawers.
Right.
And the guy looked over at him and he thought, ugh, he said to himself, it's the same as in our country. It's no big deal.
Right, right, right.
And ran out. They put up with it. They all knew they were being bugged, and they all understood that if they called home, both sides were listening to them. So they all understood how
Nothing
that's,
new there.
yeah.
Right, yeah. So the collaborations and the sending of advisors very suddenly stopped in the summer of 1960. Khrushchev actually called back all the advisors immediately. What happened at that point? Why did this happen?
Things were going badly for Mao at this point too, because there was a massive drought in China in 1959, and then right after that, it ruined all the crops. And right after that, there was a huge rainfalls in the south of China. And so everybody was tense and worried about what was happening. People were eating bark and dirt and dying. It was so Mao was distraught and not very personable, I suppose. And Khrushchev was angry at him. He just had it. He'd had it with all these sessions where he was humiliated in public. And he decided out of the blue, because I've studied Khrushchev quite a lot, actually. He very impulsive. He just got it in his mind, I've got to talk to Mao Zedong. I'm going to talk to him now. So he decides to go to a big Communist Party gathering in Romania, where the Chinese were. Well, Mao wasn't there, thank God. One of his minions was Peng Zhen. Peng Zhen was at the time the mayor of Beijing. So anyway, he appeared there and they started clashing because Khrushchev came in like gangbusters and he said these things like, Mao's an ultra leftist and he's an ultra dogmatist and he's a revisionist and and furthermore, he's only interested in himself, doesn't care about people. Oh my gosh. So Peng Zhen shoots back with these things because Khrushchev had before this had thrown aside his foreign minister and he was getting involved in foreign policy and he was making a big hay of it. He was terrible at it. Everywhere he went, they chased him away at the end. So Peng Zhen shoots back with Khrushchev blows hot and cold in foreign policy and other personal insults.
Right.
And so Khrushchev got so angry that he just said, that's it. And he told his guys, we're
Yeah.
bringing the advisors back. They're coming today. It's over. You're done.
So, right. So it was actually a combination of the consequences also of the horrendous Great Leap Forward project since 1958, and then these personal dynamics. Let's see here. If we take a step back and look at history, so in the end, Soviet communism failed, but China, especially after Mao, blossomed. Both countries have the same basic ideology. How do you explain this difference?
Well, after Stalin, after all those years of witch hunts and arrests and followings and purges, people were done with that. And yet it was a motivator. And Khrushchev came on board, and he was a reformer, as I mentioned. He just wanted people to have a good life. He wasn't about that. He didn't want terror. He didn't like it at all. But so things were going along fine. He built some new houses and things were, looking up for Soviets. But it turns out that in the factories and all the places where people worked, there was no motivation. They'd only been motivated for many, many years by torture and fear.
Mm-hmm.
And so they were unable to find anything else to replace it. And so they just started to go downhill. What worked was Stalin, of course, and what worked was Mao, who copied Stalin. Mao had no problem mistreating people, jailing them, following them, anything to make communism work. And he didn't care about torture. He didn't care about lies. He didn't care about needless deaths. So they stuck to the Stalinist kind of communism. And I would argue they still have Stalinist communism. Under
Although
Mao.
you could say that after Mao, things changed. Of course, there was economic liberalization, there were reforms, there were moments of also more artistic freedom. So you could maybe compare that to a deviation from Stalin under Khrushchev.
Exactly.
But, so
I think that's a very good point. But now, they're heading back that way.
right.
In my opinion, it's
Right.
very bad.
Right. So it's 12:30 local time now. So that's always the moment to go to the Q&A. Please put your questions under the Q&A box where I will read them. We already have one. But before we go there, let me ask you one final question. And it is, what positive lessons would you say can we learn from the Sino-Soviet friendship relations?
Well, much like the Marshall Plan, the Soviets did an incredible job of recovering China.
Right.
They had long years of war, and they came and they brought skills. They brought whole factories that they knocked down from their country and rebuilt them so they could get started early. And they also got to know China. China got to know Russia, many beautiful friendships, as I was telling you, people are nostalgic for. Russia felt empowered and more interested in the world after going to China, because brought in stuff with Chinese literature and Chinese drama and all this.
Right.
So it was the same for the Chinese too, getting to know their neighbors to the north.
Yeah.
I think, I think there was an impact from it. I think it opened both of their eyes.
Right. Yeah. So the impact of cultural relations is always great. Good. Thank you. We have a question from William Kuhl. He asks, if the Soviet advisors didn't speak Chinese, did the Chinese they were advising speak Russian, or were there dedicated translators from Russia and or China assigned to the advisors?
Very good question, actually. There weren't very many Chinese who spoke Russian, just about as the number that there would be Russians who spoke Chinese. So there were some interpreters that came around to various jobs. Most of the time, especially if it's an industrial job, they just did sort of things like this, do this, and, didn't have to speak very much. But yeah, especially when they're working in, for instance, changing how you present ideology in print or something, they definitely had interpreters. And the Russians trained interpreters and trained them very well in Chinese.
Okay, great. Yeah. I have a question here from Eric Gordon. China's foreign policy flew in the face of Soviet policy, for example, recognizing Pinochet's Chile and ambiguous support for Vietnam. What do you make of this?
They didn't really care as much in the Soviet Union. I mean, okay, they would say, you know, oh, we think they're wrong or whatever. But it seems to me that foreign policy didn't really, it wasn't on the table as much as everything else that was between them.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So at this moment, I don't see any other questions, but I'm wondering whether you can say a little bit more about the Sino-Soviet relationships in the following decades between 1960 and, say, the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991.
So yes, in the Gorbachev era, he was very interested in, well, nothing happened during the Brezhnev era in general. So Gorbachev was really the first guy who really turned to China. He came to China. In fact, he came to China during Tiananmen. I don't know if you remember this. Deng Xiaoping was the supreme leader, and he was very embarrassed that he couldn't host Gorbachev in Tiananmen. They had to move the venue because they couldn't oust the students. Right. And I think there would have been something promising there. But, you know, Gorbachev, not that long after, was deposed. So after that, there were a series of different leaders in China, and one by one, they made a trek to Russia. And you would see them together in various meetings. I actually once tracked them to see what they were doing. Basically, they were doing these sort of photo shoots and saying, we do agree. And sometimes they would try to get, the Chinese would try to get the Russians to work with them in oil and gas, that sort of thing. But Russia's better now, but in those days they promised and then they never built it, that sort of thing. I saw complaints about that. So every so often they do get together and they try to be, and I think today, they're on pretty good terms. I think the Russians are very afraid of the Belt and Road Initiative because it brings Chinese closer to them in their country and also into other countries that they care about. But so far, I think they're working together a little bit more economically, and that's the only way probably that they can get together.
Right. Thank you. There's a question from Gardner Bovenden. Such a fascinating presentation. I'm particularly interested in instances in which Chinese officials copied Soviet practices and institutions, even when the officials or their Soviet advisors knew they had had terrible consequences in the USSR. Did you encounter examples of this?
No, not really, but I bet you they do exist. I just haven't met anybody who had that experience. I haven't seen anything written about it either.
Okay.
It's a very, very good question because that they had what they were going to do.
Right. Thank you. Next question is from Stephen Aaron. Can you say anything about the project on which you are consulting for the Wende Museum?
Oh, may I?
Of course. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I only know a little bit. I went over to somebody's house to look at some artifacts from the Cultural Revolution. And I didn't know very much about them, but I have looked into it now. I understand what they're about and why and how that went about. So I am looking forward to the next exhibit and to anything I can do to help enlighten you about what I know now about these sculptures.
Right. Yeah, it will be an exhibition about Chinese Revolution ceramics. And,
Right.
yeah, and their context. Thank you. I have a comment here from Joan Agayanian Quinn. She writes, the motivation I remember in Russia was the giving of paper recognition in the factories. I'm not sure if that is a question or a comment, but I'd like to respond to that one. Yeah.
To give what kind of recognition?
Paper recognition in the factories.
Oh, to put up posters in the factories, maybe? That's what he
Maybe,
means?
I'm not sure. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's true. There was propaganda, handwritten propaganda all over the place until they started to get it more centralized. And I even saw it once when I went into a university building and there was some propaganda up for the ideological workers of the Soviet Union.
Right.
And I read it and I was like, oh my God, that's so weird. Told them,
Right,
you know, be on time, do your work, do every task, that sort of stuff.
Right. Okay, there are no other questions from the viewers right now. So another question I have for you is, what would you consider was the most, or were, if you have several examples, the most surprising elements in the stories you read from Soviet advisors who were in China, or the people you spoke with? What's stood out?
I guess I shouldn't have been surprised, but I was surprised to find out that there were affairs. There were romantic affairs. People tried to marry even. And the Soviets were completely open to this. They didn't have any problem at all. They thought that would be wonderful. Why not? And they were sad. They were saddened to find out when they got to China, they were told that there is a law against fraternization with Chinese people. So there are some funny stories of somehow some Chinese people inviting the advisors to their home, and then there was dancing, and then there was some, you know, this and that, and then they come to find out that the girl that he had danced with was taken away by the secret police and dressed down, and you know,
yeah.
a very sad thing like that.
So no lasting love relations there.
No, I think they pretty much got the idea once they did that a few times.
Right.
Word was out. Yeah, they just were not, they would not allow that. And it's weird because in the earlier years, when so many Chinese came to Moscow to study in the Communist University of the Toilers of the East in Moscow in the 1930s, there were many famous people who married each other, Chinese and Russian, and tried to make a go of it, you know, being of two countries. And there seemed to have been no holds off, but in the Maoist period, he could not take it. He wouldn't do it.
No, I understand. Okay, thank you. Next question is from Jamie Kwan. Thanks so much for your presentation. I was wondering if you could speak more about your experience working in Russian versus Chinese archives and access to documents.
Okay. In Russia, I've been in many archives, and in fact, I went to Russia on purpose the year after the fall of the Soviet Union, just so I could be the first one into the Communist Party archives, along with a bunch of other people who were waiting in line. But I've been in many archives, and the archives are very good in their archives, but they're good and you can find a lot of things. In China, I can't even actually go into a public library, let alone an archive.
Right.
And what China scholars do in America anyway, or foreign China scholars, is you know, inevitably you meet people you have written in the same field as. You meet them and maybe you get to know them, and maybe with sometime when you visit, they might give you some document that they know you need. That's possible. But other than that, it's pretty much reading the tea leaves for these documents. Or you can find stuff like, you can find all this stuff about the Great Leap Forward, like death rates and all this, but it's the slice of it is so small, it doesn't matter. Like, it's not the whole Great Leap.
Right.
So that's what we're looking at in the China field today. And they throw a huge amount of the archives into the trash, and many scholars I've known find out about that, and they take that trash home, and it's their documents. But I don't live there, so I haven't seen any trash piles I need.
Right, I see. Okay, thank you. David Edick asked, how did the Chinese see the Soviet invasion during the Second World War of Manchuria?
How did the Chinese see it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, no, they were opposed to it. They don't want them there. They thought that was their territory.
Right, right.
And they thought that, you know, in the beginning, they thought that the Soviets were coming to take over Manchuria as part of their whole thing. They had this long Sturm und Drang over the Changchun Railway that runs through Manchuria. Who owned it?
Right, right.
You can find tomes and tomes of books just out there about that.
So did that impact the Sino-Soviet relations as well, or not so much?
Not really, and that was a little before it. So
yeah, sure.
There was always a suspicion of the Russians being on their border, being on the Chinese border. The Chinese were suspicious of Russians and didn't trust them. It's only when they became the Soviet Union and they had a communist country that they got interested in them and allowed them to, you know, come into their country.
Right. Okay.
But, you know, even during the friendship period, the real friendship period, this one person who was a correspondent for Pravda, and he was working in China, he told stories about how he was always followed. He was asked to leave during presentations when somebody was going to say something they didn't want him to hear and all this. So it was a friendship.
Yeah,
way.
I understand. Okay, thank you. The next question is from George Nickel, and he asks, were Gorbachev's reforms seen as a threat to the party in China?
A threat to the Chinese Communist Party? Probably, yes. But, you know, Gorbachev was far away from that goal of having a communist country anymore. Really, he wasn't going to go down that path anymore. He tried. His reforms, no, they didn't scare China because they didn't have any effect in the USSR either. Let's be honest.
Sorry, how do you mean that?
You mean like perestroika and glasnost, those two big reforms that he brought out?
Yeah.
Glasnost means to speak your mind and be truthful. The Chinese didn't like that. Perestroika was just about redoing. It means renovating and redoing, like industry and the way you do business in your own country. And they would be for that. But if it had anything to do with politics, no.
I see. Okay. Well, Deborah, I want to thank you very much for a really fascinating presentation. It was great to have you in the series. And in 2 weeks from now, which is September 8th, also Wednesday, my guest is Xenia Nuril. She's an art historian and the Jensen Bryan Curator at the Princeton Center in Philadelphia. And we are going to talk about dream world space, Soviet intersections between art and science. So I hope to see you then and wish you 2 wonderful weeks.
Thank you.